The Good Knight Stories, The Fall of Constantinople. The Silver Knight stood motionless atop the ancient walls of Constantinople, his armor catching the pale winter light in a way that made him appear almost ghostly against the grey January sky. Below him stretched the vast expanse of the city, once the jewel of Christendom, now a shadow of its former glory. His gauntleted hands rested on the weathered stone of the Theodosian walls, feeling the subtle vibrations of history beneath his fingertips. These walls had stood for 1,000 years, repelling countless armies, surviving earthquakes and rebellions, witnessing the rise and slow decline of the greatest empire the world had ever known. But the knight knew something the walls did not. Their time was coming to an end. The wind carried the scent of the sea mingled with the smoke of cooking fires from the city below. From his vantage point, he could see the golden domes of the Hagia Sophia rising above the urban sprawl, still magnificent despite the empire's diminished state. The Great Church, as the locals called it, had stood for 9 centuries, a testament to human ingenuity and divine inspiration. The knight wondered if it would survive what was coming. Winter had settled over Constantinople with a damp chill that penetrated even the thickest cloaks. The knight's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he surveyed the landscape beyond the walls. The countryside appeared peaceful now, but he had seen the signs. Sultan Mehmed II was preparing for war, and the young Ottoman ruler's ambition was as boundless as the horizon. The knight shifted his weight, his armor making a soft metallic sound that was quickly swallowed by the vastness around him. He had arrived in the city just weeks ago, drawn by rumors of the impending siege, and a sense of duty he couldn't quite explain. He had fought in many battles, witnessed the fall of many cities, but something about Constantinople felt different. Perhaps it was because this wasn't just any city. It was the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the final link to an ancient world that was rapidly fading from memory. A group of soldiers passed by on their patrol, nodding respectfully to the Silver Knight. His reputation had preceded him, though none knew his true origins. They saw only his immaculate silver armor, his quiet competence, and his willingness to stand with them in what many believed would be their final battle. That was enough to earn their respect in these desperate times. They say the Sultan has commissioned a cannon larger than any ever built. One soldier remarked to another as they passed. A Hungarian engineer named Urban is building it for him after our emperor couldn't afford his services. Old wives' tales, his companion replied, though his voice lacked conviction. No cannon can breach these walls. They've stood for 1,000 years. The knight remained silent, but he knew better. The world was changing. The age of stone walls and knights in armor was giving way to something new, something defined by black powder and iron balls that could shatter stone as if it were clay. He had seen it happening gradually across Europe, but here, at the crossroads of East and West, the change would come suddenly and with devastating force. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, the knight turned his gaze toward the Bosporus. Somewhere beyond that strait, Sultan Mehmed was gathering his forces. The young ruler had made no secret of his ambition to capture Constantinople and make it the capital of his expanding empire. At just 21 years of age, Mehmed had already proven himself a formidable leader, intelligent and ruthless in equal measure. The knight's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see a man in the distinctive dress of a Genoese soldier, his bearing proud and his expression serious. "You must be the knight everyone is talking about," the man said, studying the silver armor with an appraising eye. "I am Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, sent by the Republic of Genoa with 700 men to aid in the defense of the city." The knight inclined his head in silent greeting, taking the measure of the man before him. Giustiniani had the look of a seasoned commander, confident but not arrogant, experienced but not weary. His arrival with 700 trained soldiers was perhaps the best news the city had received in months. "Emperor Constantine has appointed me commander of the land walls," Giustiniani continued. "I've been told you've seen more battles than most men twice your age. I could use your counsel in the days ahead." The knight nodded again, acknowledging the request without speaking. His silence was not rudeness, but habit. He had learned long ago that men revealed more when they weren't interrupted. "The situation is grave," Giustiniani said, lowering his voice, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "The Emperor has perhaps 5,000 Greek troops, and with my men and the other foreign volunteers, we might muster 8,000 defenders in total. Our spies report that Mehmet is gathering an army of at least 80,000, possibly twice that number." The odds were worse than the knight had feared, but not unexpected. The Byzantine Empire had been declining for centuries, losing territory to the Ottomans and other powers until only Constantinople and a few scattered outposts remained. Emperor Constantine XI was a capable ruler, by all accounts brave and intelligent, but he had inherited an empire in name only. "Come," Giustiniani said, gesturing towards the city. "The Emperor wishes to meet all the foreign captains. We must make plans while there is still time." As they walked along the massive walls toward the Blashenay Palace, the knight observed the defenses with a critical eye. The Theodosian walls were an engineering marvel, a triple line of fortifications with a moat designed to be virtually impregnable to medieval siege tactics. But they had been built in the 5th century, long before the advent of cannons. And now they showed signs of neglect: crumbling stonework, inadequate repairs, sections that had been damaged by earthquakes and never properly restored. The city within the walls told a similar story of faded glory. Constantinople had once housed nearly 1 million people, but now its population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their buildings collapsed or stripped for materials. The great palaces and churches remained, but many were shadows of their former splendor. Even the Hippodrome, once the center of Byzantine social life, was largely abandoned, its ancient statues and obelisks standing as lonely reminders of more prosperous times. Yet despite this decay, there was still a dignity to Constantinople that the knight found moving. This was a city of profound history and faith, where the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome had been preserved through the darkest days of what Western Europeans called the Dark Ages. Its libraries contained knowledge that had been lost elsewhere. Its churches housed relics of immeasurable spiritual significance, and its very existence represented the unbroken thread of Roman civilization stretching back more than 1,000 years. As they approached the Blashenay Palace, the knight noticed increased activity. Servants rushing about, guards standing at attention, officials in elaborate court dress coming and going with worried expressions. Emperor Constantine had moved the imperial residence to this palace in the northwestern corner of the city, close to the land walls where the main Ottoman attack would likely come. Inside, the palace was a curious mixture of opulence and austerity. The architecture and decorations spoke of imperial grandeur, intricate mosaics, gold leaf, silk hangings. But there was also a noticeable absence of the extravagance that had characterized the Byzantine court in earlier centuries. This was the court of an empire fighting for its survival, not one reveling in its power. They were led through several chambers until they reached a large hall where a group of men had gathered. Some wore the distinctive dress of Venetian nobles, others the practical attire of Genoese captains. There were representatives from various Italian states, a small contingent of Catalans, and even a few knights from as far away as England and France. All had come to defend Christendom's eastern bulwark against the Ottoman tide. At the center of the gathering stood Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor. He was a man in his late 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard streaked with grey, and eyes that reflected both intelligence and weariness. He wore a purple robe embroidered with golden eagles, the symbol of imperial authority, but the simplicity of his attire, compared to the elaborate ceremonial dress of his predecessors, was striking. "Gentlemen," the emperor said as the room fell silent, "I thank you for answering our call in this hour of need. Each of you represents the best of Christian Europe, and your presence here gives me hope that we may yet preserve this city that has stood as a beacon of civilization for more than 1,000 years." His voice was steady and dignified, betraying none of the desperation that must have been consuming him. The knight had seen many rulers in his time, but few had impressed him as immediately as Constantine XI. Here was a man who understood his place in history and was determined to face it with courage and dignity. "Our situation is grave but not hopeless," Constantine continued. "We have received word that Pope Nicholas V has sent 3 ships with provisions and some troops. The Venetians have promised a relief fleet. And now, with the arrival of Captain Giustiniani and his men, our defenses are significantly strengthened." The emperor gestured toward a large map of the city and its surroundings that had been laid out on a table. "We expect Mehmed to focus his main assault on the land walls, particularly here at the Mesoteichion, where the walls cross the valley of the Lycus River. The terrain there gives attackers a slight advantage, and the walls are somewhat lower. Captain Giustiniani will command the defense of this critical section." Giustiniani stepped forward and bowed. "My men and I are at your Majesty's service. We will hold the walls or die in the attempt." "Let us pray it doesn't come to that," Constantine replied with a grim smile. "The sea walls are less formidable than the land walls, but the currents of the Bosporus and the Golden Horn make a naval assault difficult. Nevertheless, we must be prepared for Mehmed to attempt an attack from multiple directions." The discussion continued for some time, with various captains reporting on the state of their forces and the emperor outlining his strategy for the defense. The knight listened silently, absorbing the details and forming his own assessment of their chances. The defenders were outnumbered at least 10-1, but they had the advantage of fighting behind the strongest walls in Christendom. If they could prevent the Ottomans from bringing their full numerical advantage to bear, By keeping the sea lanes open for supplies and reinforcements, and by making effective use of the walls to multiply their defensive power, they might be able to hold out until either Mehmed gave up or a relief force arrived from Europe. But these were big ifs, and the knight had lived long enough to know that in war, things rarely went according to plan. As the meeting concluded, the Emperor approached the Silver Knight directly. Up close, Constantine's face showed the strain of his position. Fine lines around his eyes, a certain tightness around his mouth, but his gaze was steady and penetrating. "They tell me you've fought in more battles than you care to count," he said, studying the knight's impassive face. "That you've seen cities fall and empires crumble, is this true?" The knight inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Then tell me," Constantine said, lowering his voice so that only the knight could hear. "Do we have a chance? Not what you would say to boost the morale of my men, but the truth as you see it." The knight considered the question carefully. He had indeed seen many cities fall, had witnessed the ebb and flow of empires across the centuries. He knew that no fortress was truly impregnable, that no army was invincible. But he had also seen desperate defenses succeed against overwhelming odds when the defenders were determined enough, and fortune smiled upon them. He met the Emperor's gaze and gave a single, measured nod. Constantine's expression remained grave, but something in his eyes lightened slightly. "That is all I needed to know," he said. "One man who has seen what you have seen, who believes we can prevail, that is worth 1,000 empty reassurances." The Emperor turned to rejoin his advisors, but paused and looked back at the knight. "They say you never remove your armor, that you sleep in it and eat in it. They say no man has seen your face. Is this also true?" Again, the knight nodded once. A faint smile touched Constantine's lips. "Then you and I are not so different. I too wear a kind of armor that I cannot remove, the weight of an empire that has endured for a millennium, now reduced to this single city. I too must present a face to the world that reveals nothing of the doubts within." He gestured toward the map on the table. "This city has fallen before, you know. The Fourth Crusade in 1204. Europeans, Christians, sacked Constantinople and established a Latin empire that lasted nearly 60 years before my ancestors reclaimed the throne. We recovered from that catastrophe. Perhaps if the worst happens, the empire will rise again someday." With that, Constantine rejoined his advisors, leaving the knight to ponder his words. The Emperor was a realist then, not blinded by imperial pride or religious fervor. He understood the gravity of their situation, but was determined to fight nonetheless. Such men were rare in the knight's experience and worth following. Outside the palace, night had fallen over Constantinople. The knight made his way through the darkened streets, past shuttered shops and homes where families gathered around meager fires. The city was quiet, but it was the quiet of apprehension, not peace. Everyone knew what was coming. They had heard the reports of Ottoman preparations, had seen the refugees arriving from outlying areas with tales of Turkish troops on the move. They knew their city stood alone against the rising power of the Ottoman Empire, and that Christendom was too divided, too preoccupied with its own internal conflicts to send significant aid. The knight found lodging in a small inn near the land walls, where the innkeeper provided him with a private room out of respect for his obvious status as a warrior of importance. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small window that looked out toward the west, toward the direction from which the Ottoman army would come. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the knight removed his gauntlets, the only piece of his armor he ever took off. His hands were strong and calloused, marked with the scars of countless battles. He flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that came with age and a lifetime of wielding sword and lance. Tomorrow he would begin assessing the city's defenses in detail, identifying weaknesses that needed to be addressed before the Ottomans arrived. There was much to be done, and precious little time. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Constantinople, the new Rome, the city of Constantine the Great, who had established it as the capital of the Roman Empire more than 1,000 years ago, the center of Eastern Christianity, home to the Hagia Sophia, and countless other churches filled with priceless icons and relics. The guardian of ancient knowledge, its libraries containing manuscripts that had been lost to the West. The bulwark that had held back the tide of Islam for centuries, allowing Christian Europe to develop in relative security. And now it all rested on the shoulders of a few thousand defenders against the might of the Ottoman Empire. The knight had seen enough of history to know that empires rose and fell, that great cities flourished and decayed, that nothing built by human hands lasted forever. But he had also seen enough of human courage to know that sometimes, against all odds, the impossible could be achieved. As he gazed out the window at the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the same stars that had looked down on Constantinople since its founding, on Rome before that, and on the countless civilizations that had risen and fallen since the dawn of time. The knight made a silent vow. He would give everything he had to defend this city, this last remnant of an ancient world. Not because he believed they would succeed. He was too much of a realist for that. But because some things were worth fighting for, even in the face of almost certain defeat. Outside, a cold wind blew in from the sea, carrying with it the first hints of spring. In the distance, beyond the walls, beyond the sight of any watchman, the Ottoman war machine was grinding inexorably forward. Sultan Mehmed II, the ambitious young ruler who dreamed of surpassing the conquests of Alexander the Great, had set his sights on the greatest prize of all, Constantinople, the city of the Caesars. The clash, when it came, would shake the foundations of the world. Dawn broke over Constantinople with a pale, watery light that did little to dispel the winter chill. The Silver Knight was already awake, standing at his window and watching as the city slowly came to life. Smoke rose from chimneys as fires were lit. Dawn broke over Constantinople with a pale, watery light that did little to dispel the winter chill. The Silver Knight was already awake, standing at his window and watching as the city slowly came to life. Smoke rose from chimneys as fires were lit for morning meals, and the first calls to prayer echoed from church towers across the urban landscape. In the distance, the waters of the Bosporus glittered faintly, connecting the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and separating Europe from Asia. The knight donned his gauntlets, completing his silver armor that had never left his body. He descended the narrow stairs of the inn, nodding silently to the innkeeper, who was busy preparing a simple breakfast of bread, olives and watered wine for his few guests. The man offered food to the knight, who declined with a small gesture. No one had ever seen him eat or drink, adding to the mystery that surrounded him. Outside, the streets were beginning to fill with people going about their daily business, though there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there in previous months. News of Ottoman preparations had spread throughout the city, and everyone from nobles to beggars understood what was at stake. Yet life continued. It had to. Bakers baked bread, fishermen brought in their morning catch, merchants opened their shops, and priests prepared for morning services. Constantinople had faced threats before and had endured. Many clung to the belief that it would endure again. The knight made his way toward the land walls, intent on beginning a thorough inspection. As he walked, he observed the people around him with a careful eye. Constantinople had once been the most populous and cosmopolitan city in the Christian world, home to Greeks, Italians, Slavs, Armenians, Jews, and countless other peoples drawn by its wealth and importance. Now its population had dwindled dramatically, but it remained remarkably diverse. He passed Orthodox priests in their distinctive black robes and cylindrical hats, Italian merchants in fine wool clothing, Turkish traders, for commerce with the Ottoman territories continued despite the looming conflict, and common Byzantine citizens in simple tunics and cloaks. What struck him most, however, was the sheer number of churches and monasteries. They seemed to be everywhere, from the magnificent domed structures that dominated the skyline to tiny chapels tucked away in narrow alleys. Constantinople was truly a city of faith, where the rhythms of religious observance marked the hours and days. The knight wondered how many of these sacred places would survive what was coming. At the land walls, he found increased activity as workers labored to strengthen the defenses under the supervision of military engineers. The Theodosian walls were actually a complex system of fortifications, consisting of 3 parallel walls and a moat. The outer wall was smaller, about 8 meters high, fronted by a terrace and the moat. Behind it stood the main wall, a massive structure nearly 12 meters high and 5 meters thick, punctuated by towers that rose an additional 10 meters. Behind this was a third, smaller wall that served as a final line of defense. The knight walked along the military road that ran behind the main wall, observing the work being done. Masons were repairing crumbling sections. Carpenters were constructing wooden platforms to allow defenders to fire down on attackers, and laborers were clearing the moat of debris that had accumulated over years of neglect. Emperor Constantine had ordered these repairs months ago, recognizing the threat posed by Mehmed, but progress had been slow due to limited resources and manpower. "Impressive, aren't they?" a voice said beside him. The knight turned to see Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, who had approached quietly despite his armor. When they were built 1,000 years ago, these walls made Constantinople the most impregnable city in the world. They've repelled countless attacks, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and yes, even Turks. The knight nodded, acknowledging both the wall's historical significance and their present reality. They were indeed impressive, but they were also showing their age, and more importantly, they had been designed in an era before cannons. Giustiniani seemed to read his thoughts. "You're wondering if they can withstand Mehmed's artillery." It wasn't a question. So am I. These walls were built to withstand battering rams and siege towers, not iron balls fired from cannons. But they're thick, and we're reinforcing the most vulnerable sections with timber and packed earth, which absorb the impact of cannonballs better than stone. They continued walking along the walls, discussing defensive strategies and identifying areas that needed additional strengthening. Giustiniani was a professional soldier with extensive experience in siege warfare, and the knight found him to be both knowledgeable and pragmatic. He didn't minimize the threat they faced, but neither did he succumb to despair. The Emperor has placed me in command of the land walls, Giustiniani explained as they reached the Mesotachion, the section of wall that crossed the valley of the Lycus River. This is where Mehmed will concentrate his attack. The ground slopes upward toward the walls here, giving his artillery a better angle of fire, and the walls themselves are slightly lower due to the terrain. The knight surveyed the area with a critical eye. Giustiniani was right. This was the most vulnerable point in the land walls. If he were commanding the Ottoman forces, this is precisely where he would focus his main assault. "We're strengthening this section as much as possible," Giustiniani continued, gesturing toward workers who were piling earth and timber against the base of the walls. "And I've positioned my best men here. The Emperor himself will command the Byzantine troops in this sector." They spent the rest of the morning inspecting the land walls from end to end, from the Golden Horn in the north to the Sea of Marmara in the south. The knight was impressed by the thoroughness of Giustiniani's preparations, but concerned by the limited number of defenders. Even with the Genoese reinforcements, there were simply not enough men to adequately defend the entire perimeter of the city. As midday approached, they made their way to the sea walls along the Golden Horn, the inlet that formed Constantinople's northern harbor. These walls were less formidable than the land walls, as the natural protection provided by the water had made massive fortifications unnecessary. However, a huge chain had been installed across the mouth of the Golden Horn, supported by floating wooden barrels to prevent enemy ships from entering the harbor. This chain had been a key element of Constantinople's defenses for centuries. "The chain is our best defense against a naval attack," Giustiniani explained as they observed workers testing the mechanism that raised and lowered it. Without it, the Ottomans could sail directly into the harbor and attack the sea walls, which are our weakest point. The knight nodded, understanding the strategic importance of the chain. As long as it remained in place, the Golden Horn would remain secure, protecting the northern flank of the city and ensuring that the defenders could concentrate their limited manpower on the land walls. They continued their inspection along the sea walls facing the Bosporus and the Sea of Marmara. These were stronger than those along the Golden Horn, but still not as formidable as the land walls. However, the strong currents in these waters made naval attacks difficult, providing a natural defense that had served the city well throughout its history. As the afternoon waned, they returned to the Blanchenois Palace, where Emperor Constantine had called a council of war. The palace was bustling with activity, as military commanders, civic officials, and church leaders gathered to discuss the defense of the city. The council chamber was a large, vaulted room with windows overlooking the Golden Horn. Maps and documents were spread across a massive table of polished marble, and servants moved quietly around the perimeter. providing refreshments to the assembled leaders. Emperor Constantine sat at the head of the table, his expression grave but composed. To his right was Lucas Notaras, the Grand Duke and commander of the Byzantine navy. To his left was Cardinal Isidore, the papal legate who had been sent by Pope Nicholas V to implement the union of the churches, the controversial agreement that had theoretically reunited the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches in 1452. The Knight and Giustiniani took their places among the other military commanders, as Constantine called the meeting to order. "Gentlemen," the emperor began, his voice steady and authoritative, "our scouts report that Sultan Mehmed has begun moving his army from Adrianople. They will reach Constantinople within weeks. We must finalize our defense plans now." A murmur ran through the assembled leaders, a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "Captain Giustiniani and our distinguished knight in silver have completed their inspection of our defenses," Constantine continued, nodding towards them. "Captain, please share your assessment with the council." Giustiniani rose and addressed the gathering. "The land walls are in better condition than I had feared, thanks to your Majesty's foresight in ordering repairs. However, they were designed before the age of cannons, and we must expect that Mehmed's artillery will cause significant damage. We are reinforcing the most vulnerable sections with earth and timber, which will help absorb the impact of cannonballs." He pointed to the map spread out on the table. "The Mesotikion, here where the walls cross the Lycus Valley, is our most vulnerable point. This is where Mehmed will concentrate his main assault. I recommend that we position our best troops here, with reserves ready to reinforce any section that comes under heavy attack." The discussion continued for hours as they debated various aspects of the defense: the deployment of troops, the stockpiling of supplies, the evacuation of civilians from areas near the walls, and the coordination between the various contingents of defenders. The knight listened silently, impressed by the clarity of thought and unity of purpose displayed by most of the leaders, though he noted underlying tensions between the Byzantines and their Latin allies, and between supporters and opponents of the union of the churches. As the council was concluding, a messenger arrived with urgent news. He whispered something to one of Constantine's aides, who immediately approached the emperor. Constantine's expression darkened as he received the information. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I have just received word that Mehmed has completed construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosporus, directly across from the one he built last year on the Asian side. These fortresses, armed with heavy cannons, now control the strait completely. No ship can pass without Ottoman permission." The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. Constantinople was now effectively cut off from the Black Sea, its primary source of grain and other supplies. Any relief fleet from Europe would have to fight its way past these fortresses to reach the city. "There is more," Constantine continued grimly. "Our informants report that Mehmed has contracted a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build cannons of unprecedented size, cannons capable of breaching our walls." This news sent another ripple of concern through the council. The knight had heard rumors of these cannons, but had hoped they were exaggerated. If they were real, and as powerful as reported, they could fundamentally alter the balance of the coming siege. "We must prepare for the worst," Constantine concluded, while praying for divine intervention. Constantinople has stood as the bulwark of Christendom for more than 1,000 years. It has weathered countless storms. With God's help and your courage, it will weather this one as well. As the council dispersed, the knight found himself walking alongside Cardinal Isidore, the papal legate. Isidore was a Greek by birth who had risen high in the Catholic Church, becoming one of the few Eastern clerics to achieve the rank of cardinal. He had been sent to Constantinople to implement the union of the churches, a deeply unpopular move among many Orthodox believers who saw it as a betrayal of their traditions. "You do not speak," Isidore observed, studying the knight's impassive silver helmet. "But I sense you understand the gravity of our situation better than most. You have seen many battles, have you not?" The knight nodded once. "Then you know that wars are won not just by strength of arms, but by unity of purpose," Isidore continued. "And therein lies our greatest weakness. The city is divided, between those who accept the union and those who reject it, between Greeks and Latins, between those who believe we can prevail and those who have already given up hope." They had reached a small courtyard within the palace complex, where a fountain bubbled softly amid the gathering dusk. Isidore paused, looking up at the darkening sky. "I fear that God has turned his face from us because of our divisions," he said quietly. "The Orthodox reject the authority of Rome, while Rome itself is more concerned with its conflicts in Italy than with the fate of Constantinople. The Venetians and Genoese compete for trade advantages, even as the city they both profit from faces extinction. And the common people," he sighed. "Many of them would rather see the city fall to the Turks than be saved by the Catholics." The knight remained silent, but he understood the cardinal's concerns. He had seen how internal divisions could weaken a city or kingdom as surely as any external enemy. Constantinople was not just facing the Ottoman army, it was also struggling with its own deep-seated conflicts. "Yet I have hope," Isidore said, his voice strengthening. "Emperor Constantine is a man of rare quality, pious, courageous, and wise. If anyone can unite this city in its darkest hour, it is he. And there are many, both Greek and Latin, who understand what is at stake. This is not just a battle for a city, it is a battle for civilization itself." With that, the cardinal bowed slightly and took his leave, his red robes swirling around him as he disappeared into the gathering darkness. The knight remained in the courtyard for a time, contemplating Isidore's words. The cardinal was right about the divisions within Constantinople, but he had perhaps understated their depth. The knight had sensed the tension in the streets, had heard the muttered complaints against the Latin heretics and the Greek schismatics. He had seen how the Orthodox monks openly preached against the union, declaring that it was better for the city to fall to the Turks than to submit to Rome. These divisions were not new. They had been festering for centuries, ever since the Great Schism of 1054 had formally split the Christian Church into Eastern and Western branches. The Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Western Christians had sacked Constantinople and established a Latin empire, had deepened the wounds. Even now, 250 years later, many Greeks had not forgotten or forgiven that betrayal. The union of the churches, signed at Florence in 1439, had been a desperate attempt to heal the schism and secure Western aid against the Ottoman threat. but it had been rejected by much of the Orthodox clergy and populace, who saw it as a surrender of their theological traditions. Emperor Constantine supported the union, as had his brother and predecessor John VIII, but they had been unable to overcome the deep-seated resistance of their people. And so Constantinople faced its greatest threat divided against itself, with many of its citizens more concerned with theological disputes than with the Ottoman army gathering on their doorstep. The knight sighed inwardly. He had seen this pattern before, in other cities and other times. People focused on their internal differences until an external threat forced them to unite, often too late. As night fell over the city, the knight made his way back to his lodgings. The streets were quieter now, with most people having retreated to their homes for the evening meal and rest. But there was still activity around the walls, where workers continued their repairs by torchlight, and in the churches, where priests led evening prayers for the salvation of the city. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of chanting, deep, resonant voices raised in the ancient liturgy of the Orthodox Church. The knight paused to listen, struck by the beauty and solemnity of the music. Whatever their theological differences, the people of Constantinople possessed a profound faith that had sustained them through centuries of trials. Perhaps it would sustain them through this one as well. At his inn, the knight found a message waiting for him, a summons from Emperor Constantine for a private audience the following morning. The innkeeper, who delivered the message, seemed impressed that his guest had attracted imperial attention, though he was too respectful or too intimidated to ask questions. The knight spent the night in silent meditation, seated on the floor of his room with his back against the wall, his sword across his knees. He did not sleep, or if he did, it was a state of rest indistinguishable from wakefulness to any observer. His mind ranged over the city's defenses, identifying weaknesses and considering strategies, while his spirit prepared for the battle to come. Morning arrived with a thin, cold rain that shrouded the city in mist and turned the streets to mud. The knight made his way to the Blashanai Palace, his silver armor gleaming dully in the grey light. The palace guards, recognizing him from the previous day's council, admitted him without question and directed him to a small, private chamber where the emperor awaited. Constantine was alone, standing by a window that overlooked the Golden Horn. He turned as the knight entered, his face showing the strain of his position, but his bearing still regal and composed. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for the knight to approach. "I value your assessment of our situation." "Thank you for coming," Constantine said, gesturing for the knight to approach. "I value your assessment of our situation. You have seen more sieges than any man alive, if the stories about you are true." The knight inclined his head slightly, neither confirming nor denying the emperor's words. Constantine smiled faintly. "Your silence is itself an answer." He turned back to the window, gazing out at the misty waters of the Golden Horn. "I asked you here because I need counsel that is both honest and dispassionate. My generals tell me what they think I wish to hear. My advisors are divided by their own interests and allegiances. But you have no stake in our political or religious disputes. You see with clear eyes." The emperor was silent for a moment, collecting his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more intimate. "I have sent appeals for aid to every Christian power in Europe, to the Pope, to the kings of France and England, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to the Italian city-states, the responses have been disappointing. Promises of prayers, vague assurances of support that may come too late, if at all. A few ships, a few hundred men. He sighed heavily. Christendom is too divided, too preoccupied with its own internal conflicts, to unite against the Ottoman threat. The knight listened silently, understanding the emperor's frustration. The Western powers had been promising aid to Constantinople for decades, using the threat of Ottoman expansion to extract concessions from the Byzantine emperors, most notably the union of the churches, but delivering little in return. And yet, Constantine continued, straightening his shoulders, we must fight with what we have. Tell me, knight, what do you make of our defenses, of our chances? The knight considered the question carefully. He had spent the previous day examining the city's fortifications, assessing the number and quality of its defenders, and observing the morale of its people. The land walls were still formidable, despite their age and the neglect they had suffered in recent decades. The sea walls were weaker, but protected by natural defenses, the currents of the Bosporus and the Golden Horn, and the great chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the harbor. The defenders were outnumbered at least 10 to 1, but they would be fighting from strong positions, and many, especially the Genoese and Venetian contingents, were experienced soldiers. If it were a conventional siege, the knight would have given Constantinople a fair chance of holding out until either Mehmed gave up or a relief force arrived from the west. But the reports of Mehmed's massive cannons changed the equation. If those cannons were as powerful as described, they could breach even the mighty Theodosian walls, negating Constantinople's greatest defensive advantage. The knight moved to a map of the city that was spread out on a table nearby. He pointed to the Mesoteikion, the section of the land walls that crossed the Lycus Valley, indicating that this was where the main Ottoman assault would come. Constantine nodded. Yes, Captain Giustiniani has identified that as our most vulnerable point. We are strengthening it as best we can. The knight then pointed to the sea walls along the Golden Horn, suggesting that they too required attention. The chain will protect us from naval attack there, Constantine said, though he sounded less certain. And the Venetian and Genoese ships on the harbor will provide additional defense. Finally, the knight pointed to the city itself, making a sweeping gesture that encompassed its entirety. Constantine frowned, not immediately understanding. The city? You mean the people? The knight nodded once. The emperor's expression darkened. Ah, yes, the divisions among my subjects. You have perceived that already. He moved away from the window, pacing slowly across the chamber. It is my greatest concern. Many of my people, especially the monks and the lower clergy, oppose the union of the churches. They see it as a betrayal of orthodoxy, a submission to Rome that sacrifices our theological traditions for political expediency. He stopped pacing and faced the knight directly. They are not entirely wrong. The union was a political necessity, the only way to secure Western aid against the Ottoman threat. But it has divided the city at the very moment when unity is most essential. The knight remained motionless, his silver armor reflecting the dim light of the chamber, his thoughts hidden behind his impassive helmet. There is a saying among the people, Constantine continued, his voice tinged with bitterness. Better the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat. Some of my subjects would rather see Constantinople fall to the Turks than be saved by the Catholics." He shook his head in disbelief. They do not understand what Ottoman rule would mean for them, for their faith, for this city that has been the center of Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years. The knight understood the emperor's frustration. He had seen similar divisions in other cities facing external threats, people focusing on their internal differences until it was too late to unite against the common enemy. It was a pattern as old as civilization itself. "I am trying to bridge these divisions," Constantine said, resuming his pacing. "I attend both Orthodox and Catholic services. I speak of our common Christian heritage, our shared values and beliefs. I remind them that Mehmed, for all his tolerance toward Christians in his domains, is still a Muslim ruler who dreams of conquering the Christian world." He stopped again, his expression troubled. But the wounds of the past run deep. The sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204 is still a living memory for many, passed down through generations. They remember how Western Christians pillaged this city, desecrated our churches, stole our relics and treasures. The knight nodded slightly. He too remembered the Fourth Crusade, though not from stories passed down but from personal experience. A fact that would have astonished the emperor had he known it. He had seen the Latin knights and their Venetian allies storm the city, had witnessed their brutality and greed. It had been one of the darkest chapters in the history of Christendom, a betrayal that had weakened Byzantium irreparably and poisoned relations between East and West for centuries. But we cannot change the past, Constantine said firmly. We can only face the future, and that future, if we are to have one, requires unity between Greeks and Latins, between Orthodox and Catholic, between nobles and commoners. We must stand together, or we will fall separately. The emperor's words were passionate, his conviction evident. The knight could see why Constantine XI was respected even by those who disagreed with his policies. He was a man of principle and courage, determined to do his duty to his empire and his people, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "So, knight," Constantine said, returning to his original question, "what do you make of our chances? Will Constantinople stand or fall?" The knight remained silent for a long moment, weighing his response. Then slowly, deliberately, he drew his sword, a magnificent weapon of gleaming steel, its hilt adorned with intricate silver work. He laid it on the table beside the map, pointing toward the east, toward the Ottoman forces gathering beyond the walls. Constantine studied the gesture, his expression grave. "You believe we will fight, and fight well," he interpreted, "but the outcome is in God's hands." The knight inclined his head in agreement. The emperor smiled faintly. "A soldier's answer, and a wise one." He picked up the sword, testing its balance with an experienced hand. "This is a remarkable weapon, old yet perfectly maintained. Like our city, perhaps, ancient but still strong." He returned the sword to the knight with a respectful nod. "We will fight, and fight well, and we will pray that God grants us victory, or at least a death worthy of our ancestors." As the knight sheathed his sword, a servant entered the chamber and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, Captain Giustiniani requests an immediate audience. He brings news from our scouts." Constantine straightened, his momentary vulnerability replaced by imperial composure. "Send him in." Giustiniani entered briskly, his face grim. He bowed to the emperor and acknowledged the knight with a nod before delivering his report. "Your Majesty, our scouts have confirmed that Mehmed's army has departed from Adrianople. They are marching toward Constantinople in force, and the rumors of his cannons appear to be true. They report seeing massive guns being transported by teams of oxen, dozens of them, including one of enormous size that requires a team of 60 oxen to move." Constantine received this news with remarkable calm. "How long before they reach our walls?" 2 weeks, perhaps 3 if the weather worsens," Giustiniani replied. "The roads are poor at this time of year, and moving such heavy artillery is slow work." "Then we have little time," the emperor said decisively. "Captain, double the work crews on the walls. I want every weakness addressed, every repair completed before Mehmed arrives. Requisition whatever materials you need: timber, stone, iron. Strip abandoned buildings if necessary." "Yes, Your Majesty," Giustiniani acknowledged. "And begin moving civilians away from the areas near the walls." Constantine continued, "Especially from the Lycus Valley sector. They should take shelter in the central districts or near the sea walls." "It will be done," Giustiniani assured him. "What of our supplies?" Constantine asked. "How long can we withstand a siege?" "With careful rationing, 3 months," Giustiniani estimated. "Perhaps 4. We have good stores of grain and preserved food, and the cisterns are full, as long as we control the Golden Horn and can receive occasional shipments from Galata or from Venetian and Genoese vessels. We should not starve." "Ensure that the supplies are distributed fairly," Constantine ordered. "I will not have the poor suffering while the wealthy hoard food, and strengthen the guard on our granaries and water cisterns. In a long siege, they will become as valuable as gold." As Giustiniani departed to carry out these orders, Constantine turned back to the knight. "It begins," he said simply, "the final test of the Roman Empire. For that is what we still are, knight. Romans. Not in the sense that the West understands, but as the direct inheritors of Constantine the Great and Justinian, of a tradition that stretches back more than 1,000 years. The knight nodded in understanding. The Byzantines had always called themselves Romans, Romaioi, seeing their empire not as a successor state, but as the direct continuation of the Roman Empire, which had simply shifted its center from the Tiber to the Bosporus. "I would ask a favor of you," Constantine said, his tone more personal. "Captain Giustiniani will command the defense of the land walls, as we discussed yesterday. But I would value your presence at the Mesotachion, where the fighting will be fiercest. Your experience and your unique qualities would strengthen our defenders there." The knight inclined his head in acceptance. It was where he had intended to position himself in any case. At the point of greatest danger, where his skills would be most needed. "Thank you," Constantine said with genuine gratitude. "Now I must attend to 1,000 details before Mehmed arrives, but I am glad we had this conversation. It is good to know that in our darkest hour, Constantinople has defenders like you." With that, the emperor dismissed the knight and turned his attention to the pressing matters of preparing his city for the coming siege. Outside the palace, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting a gray pall over the city. the knight made his way through streets that were noticeably more active than the previous day. Word of the Ottoman advance had clearly spread, and people were preparing for the siege, securing their homes, stockpiling food and water, moving valuables to safer locations. Some were leaving the city entirely, heading for the countryside, or seeking passage on ships bound for the Aegean Islands or Italy. The knight observed all this with a practiced eye, noting both the practical preparations and the emotional state of the populace. There was fear, certainly, but also a kind of resigned determination. These people had lived under the shadow of Ottoman expansion for generations. Many had family members who had already experienced life under Turkish rule in territories previously lost by the empire. They knew what was coming, both the immediate dangers of the siege and the long-term implications of Ottoman conquest. As he approached the land walls, the knight saw that Giustiniani had wasted no time in implementing the emperor's orders. The work crews had been doubled, with men and women of all ages and social classes now participating in the desperate effort to strengthen the city's defenses. Nobles worked alongside commoners, Greeks alongside Italians, united at least temporarily by the common threat. The knight spent the rest of the day assisting in the preparations, lending his strength and expertise where needed. He helped position catapults and ballistae on the walls, advised on the placement of caltrops and other obstacles in the moat, and demonstrated techniques for reinforcing gates against battering rams. Though he never spoke, his actions communicated clearly, and the defenders quickly came to respect his knowledge and skill. As dusk approached, the knight found himself working alongside a group of monks who were helping to pile earth and timber against the base of the walls. They were led by a tall, ascetic-looking man with a long grey beard and piercing eyes, clearly a figure of some authority within the Orthodox Church. "You are the knight in silver armor that everyone is talking about," the monk said, studying him with open curiosity. "They say you have fought in 100 battles, that you never speak, that no man has seen your face." He paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "I am Gennadius Scholarius, a humble servant of God and a scholar of theology." The knight recognized the name. Gennadius was one of the leading opponents of the union of the churches, a brilliant theologian who had once supported the reconciliation with Rome, but had turned against it after the Council of Florence. His influence among the Orthodox clergy and the common people was enormous. "You fight for our city," Gennadius continued, "and for that I thank you. But I wonder, do you understand what you are fighting for? Do you know what is truly at stake here?" The knight remained silent, continuing his work of packing earth against the stone base of the wall. "This is not merely a battle for territory or power," Gennadius said, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "It is a battle for the soul of orthodoxy. For centuries, Constantinople has been the center of the true faith, preserving the traditions and doctrines established by the apostles and the church fathers. But now, our emperor and his Latin allies would have us submit to Rome, to accept the heresies of the Pope in exchange for military aid that never seems to materialize." The monk's companions nodded in agreement, their expressions solemn. "The union of the churches is a betrayal of everything we hold sacred," Gennadius continued passionately. "It requires us to accept doctrines that our fathers rejected, the Filioque clause, the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, the primacy of the Pope over all other patriarchs. These may seem like small matters to a soldier, but to us they are fundamental to our understanding of God and his relationship with humanity. The knight listened without reaction, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. He had witnessed countless theological disputes over the centuries, and had seen how they could divide communities as surely as any political conflict. Some say it is better to accept these compromises than to fall to the Turks, Gennadius acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. And perhaps they are right, in a worldly sense. But what profit is it to gain the whole world and lose one's soul? If we abandon the true faith for political expediency, what will be left of Byzantium worth saving? It was a question that many in Constantinople were asking themselves as Mehmed's army approached. The knight had heard similar debates in taverns and marketplaces throughout the city, ordinary people wrestling with profound theological and existential questions in the shadow of impending doom. "I do not expect you to answer," Gennadius said with a faint smile. "Your silence is well known, but I hope you will consider these matters as you fight for our city. Remember that the walls and buildings are not Constantinople. The faith and traditions of its people are the true city, the true empire, and those can survive even if the physical city falls." With that, the monk and his companions gathered their tools and moved on to another section of the wall, leaving the knight to ponder his words. As night fell, the knight made his way back toward his lodgings, passing through neighborhoods that were now buzzing with activity despite the late hour. Families were boarding up windows, reinforcing doors, and digging small shelters in their courtyards or cellars. The more affluent were hiring guards to protect their properties, while the poor were forming mutual defense associations, agreeing to watch over each other's homes and possessions. The knight also noticed increased religious activity. Churches were filled with people attending special services, praying for divine protection. Processions wound through the streets, led by priests carrying icons and relics, the most sacred treasures of Byzantium, objects believed to have miraculous powers. The famous icon of the Theotokos Hode. The knight also noticed increased religious activity. Churches were filled with people attending special services, praying for divine protection. Processions wound through the streets, led by priests carrying icons and relics, the most sacred treasures of Byzantium, objects believed to have miraculous powers. The famous icon of the Theotokos Hodegetria, said to have been painted by Saint Luke himself, was carried along the land walls, a tradition that had been followed whenever the city was threatened. In the midst of this religious fervor, the knight observed something else, a growing sense of unity among the city's diverse population. Greeks and Italians, Orthodox and Catholic, rich and poor, all were joining in these prayers and processions. Whatever their differences, they shared a common faith in God and a common love for Constantinople. Perhaps in the face of imminent danger, the divisions that Constantine and Giustiniani had feared were beginning to heal. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of feverish activity. The knight divided his time between helping to strengthen the defenses, particularly at the critical Mesoteikion section, and training with the defenders. Though he never spoke, he demonstrated combat techniques and defensive tactics that many of the younger soldiers had never seen before. His skill with sword, spear, and bow was remarkable, and his endurance seemed almost supernatural. He worked from dawn to dusk without rest, food, or water, his silver armor gleaming in the winter sun. Reports from scouts arrived daily, tracking the progress of Mehmed's army. The Ottoman force was massive, at least 80,000 men, possibly as many as 150,000, including elite Janissary infantry, Sipahi cavalry, and auxiliary troops from throughout the Sultan's domains. They were accompanied by a siege train of unprecedented size, with dozens of cannons, including the massive bombard designed by the Hungarian engineer Urban, which required a team of 60 oxen to transport. On April 2nd, 1453, the first elements of the Ottoman army appeared on the horizon, visible from the highest towers of the land walls. By April 5th, Mehmed himself had arrived with the main body of his forces, establishing his red and gold tent near the Mesotakion, directly opposite the section of wall defended by Emperor Constantine and Captain Giustiniani. The knight stood on the battlements, observing the Ottoman encampment through the clear spring air. The Sultan's army stretched as far as the eye could see, their tents and banners covering the hills and valleys beyond the walls. Campfires dotted the landscape, and the distant sound of drums and horns carried on the breeze. It was an awesome display of military might, designed to intimidate the defenders before the first shot was fired. Beside him, Giustiniani studied the Ottoman positions with a professional eye. "They're setting up their artillery," he noted, pointing to areas where teams of men were constructing platforms for the cannons. "See there, and there. Those will be the main battery positions aimed at the Mesotaishion. And look at the size of that bombard they're positioning directly opposite us. It must be Urban's monster." The knight nodded, his gaze fixed on the enormous cannon being maneuvered into position about half a mile from the walls. Even at this distance, its size was impressive, a bronze behemoth that dwarfed the men working around it. "They say it can fire a stone ball weighing 1,200 pounds. Giustiniani continued, his voice a mixture of awe and apprehension. No wall in Christendom was built to withstand such power. We must be ready to repair breaches quickly. The knight gestured towards the moat that ran along the base of the outer wall, suggesting that it should be deepened and widened where possible. "Yes, that's being done," Giustiniani confirmed, "and we're preparing obstacles, caltrops, stakes, pitfalls to slow any assault through a breach. But our best defense will be counterattacks to drive them back before they can establish a foothold." They were interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from Emperor Constantine, summoning them to an urgent council. They made their way quickly to the Imperial command post, which has been established in a tower near the Mesotakion. Constantine had moved from the Blachernai Palace to be closer to the expected point of attack, demonstrating his commitment to leading from the front. The command post was a hive of activity, with officers coming and going, messengers delivering reports, and clerks recording orders and inventories. Maps and diagrams covered the walls, showing the disposition of forces along the defenses. Constantine himself stood at a table in the center of the room, deep in conversation with Lucas Notaras and Cardinal Isidore. "Ah, Captain Sir Knight," the Emperor greeted them as they entered. "Come, we have received a message from Mehmed." He held up a scroll bearing the Sultan's elaborate seal. "Mehmed offers us terms for surrender." Constantine explained, his expression neutral. If we yield the city peacefully, he guarantees the safety of all inhabitants. Christians will be allowed to practice their faith, though some churches will be converted to mosques. Those who wish to leave may do so with their possessions. Those who stay will pay the jizya tax, but will otherwise be left in peace. And if we refuse? Giustiniani asked, though he clearly knew the answer. If we refuse, Constantine replied grimly, he promises to take the city by force, in which case he cannot guarantee the safety of anyone. His soldiers will be permitted the traditional 3 days of unrestricted plunder. A heavy silence fell over the room as they contemplated the implications of these terms. The 3 days of plunder was a standard practice in medieval warfare, a reward for soldiers who had endured the hardships of a siege. It meant unrestricted looting, violence, and enslavement, a fate that had befallen many cities throughout history. "What is your Majesty's response?" Cardinal Isidore asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Constantine straightened, his expression resolute. "Constantinople is not mine to surrender. It belongs to God, to the memory of its founders and builders, to the generations who have defended it for more than 1,000 years. I am merely its custodian for this moment in history." He looked around at the assembled leaders, his gaze steady and determined. "We will fight." There were nods of approval around the room. No one had expected any other answer from Constantine XI, the last of the Palaiologos dynasty, the final Roman emperor. "I have prepared my response to Mehmed," Constantine continued, indicated another scroll on the table. "I honor him as a sovereign and acknowledge his strength, but I inform him that we are resolved to defend our city to the last drop of our blood. We place our trust in God, who can save us even at this late hour if he so wills." "A worthy answer, Your Majesty," Giustiniani said with evident approval, "and one that Mehmed will respect, even if it angers him. He knows the value of courage." "Let us hope so," Constantine replied. "Now, to practical matters. Our scouts report that Mehmed has positioned his forces all around the city, but the main army is concentrated here, opposite the land walls. His fleet has taken up positions in the Bosporus and the Sea of Marmara, but they cannot enter the Golden Horn due to our chain. This gives us an advantage. We can concentrate our limited manpower on the land walls, where the main assault will come." The discussion turned to the deployment of forces, the stockpiling of weapons and materials for repairs, and the organization of reserves that could be quickly moved to any section of the walls that came under heavy attack. The knight listened attentively, occasionally making gestures to suggest tactical adjustments, which Constantine and Giustiniani considered seriously. As the council concluded, Constantine addressed them one final time. "Tomorrow, Mehmed will likely begin his bombardment. It will be unlike anything this city has ever experienced. Prepare your men for the shock of it. Remind them that stone can be repaired, but courage and determination are what truly defend a city." He looked directly at the knight as he added, "And remember that we do not fight alone. God is with us, and the prayers of all Christendom rise on our behalf." The knight inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the emperor's words without necessarily endorsing their optimism. He had seen too many cities fall, too many prayers go unanswered, to place his faith entirely in divine intervention. But he respected Constantine's need to maintain morale, to give his people something to believe in beyond their own limited strength. That night, a strange calm settled over Constantinople. The frantic preparations of the previous weeks were largely complete. The walls had been repaired and reinforced as much as possible. Weapons had been distributed, positions assigned, reserves organized. Now there was nothing to do but wait for the storm to break. The knight spent the night on the walls, moving silently among the defenders, his silver armor catching the moonlight. His presence was a comfort to the men, many of whom were experiencing their first siege. They had heard stories of his exploits, of his seemingly supernatural endurance and skill. Some whispered that he was an angel sent by God to aid them in their darkest hour. Others suggested he was a legendary hero returned from the past, Achilles or Alexander or Constantine the Great himself. The knight neither confirmed nor denied these rumors, allowing his mystery to enhance his effect on morale. Dawn on April 6th, 1453, broke clear and cold, the rising sun casting long shadows across the landscape. From his position on the walls, the knight could see activity in the Ottoman camp. Soldiers forming up, officers shouting orders, teams of men making final adjustments to the massive cannons. Mehmed was preparing to begin the bombardment. Around mid-morning, a flag was raised above the Sultan's tent, the signal to commence firing. There was a moment of breathless anticipation, and then a sound like thunder rolled across the plain as Urban's great bombard discharged for the first time. The knight watched the trajectory of the massive stone ball as it arced through the air, seeming to move in slow motion due to its enormous size. It struck the wall about 100 yards to his right, the impact sending a shudder through the entire structure. Stone fragments flew in all directions, and a cloud of dust rose from the point of impact. When it cleared, a section of the outer wall had been reduced to rubble. A cheer went up from the Ottoman lines, while the defenders stared in shock at the destruction wrought by a single shot. Before they could recover, more cannons opened fire, their balls striking various points along the walls. None were as large as Urban's bombard, but together they created a continuous barrage that tested the defenders' nerves as much as the wall's strength. Giustiniani was quick to respond, ordering repair teams to the damaged sections. Men rushed forward with timber, stones, and earth, working frantically to fill the gaps before the Ottomans could launch an assault. The knight joined one such team, helping to move massive blocks of stone that would have required several ordinary men to lift. The bombardment continued throughout the day, with Urban's great cannon firing approximately every half hour due to the time required to cool, clean, and reload it. The smaller cannons maintained a more rapid fire, creating a constant thunder that made communication difficult and frayed the defenders' nerves. By nightfall, several sections of the outer wall had been severely damaged, though the main wall behind it remained largely intact. As darkness fell, the Ottoman bombardment slackened, allowing the defenders to make more substantial repairs. Working by torchlight, they rebuilt damaged sections, cleared debris from the moat, and prepared for the next day's onslaught. The knight moved among them, lending his strength where it was most needed, and his silent presence where morale was flagging. Emperor Constantine himself walked the walls that night, speaking with his soldiers, encouraging them, reminding them of what they were fighting for. When he encountered the knight, he paused, studying the impassive silver helmet that concealed whatever expression might lie beneath. "They say you never tire," Constantine remarked, his voice low enough that only the knight could hear. "That you need no food, no water, no rest. Some of my men believe you are not human at all, but a guardian spirit sent to aid us in our time of need." He smiled faintly. "I make no such assumptions, but I am grateful for your presence, whatever your nature." The knight inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "The first day is always the hardest." Constantine continued, gazing out toward the Ottoman camp, where thousands of campfires twinkled in the darkness. "The shock of the bombardment, the realization of what we face. But my men have borne it well. They are adapting, learning to work amidst the chaos, to ignore the noise and focus on their tasks." His expression grew more serious. "Tomorrow will be worse. Mehmed will adjust his aim, concentrate his fire on the weakest points, and he may begin probing attacks to test our defenses." The knight nodded in agreement. It was standard siege tactics: use artillery to create breaches, then send small forces to test the defenders' response before committing to a full-scale assault. "We must be vigilant," Constantine said, more to himself than to the knight. "Every breach must be repaired, every probe repulsed. We cannot allow them to gain even a temporary foothold on the walls." He turned back to the knight, his expression resolute. "Get what rest you can, my friend. Dawn will come all too soon." With that, the Emperor continued his rounds, stopping to speak with each group of defenders, his calm confidence and personal courage inspiring them more than any formal speech could have done. The knight remained on the walls through the night, requiring no rest, as Constantine had noted. He used the time to study the Ottoman positions, identifying their main battery emplacements, the locations of their elite units, and the likely avenues of attack when they eventually launched their assault. He also observed the defenders, noting which units seemed most reliable, which officers most competent, which sections of the wall most vulnerable. This information would be crucial in the days to come. Dawn on April 7th brought a renewal of the Ottoman bombardment, even more intense than the previous day. Mehmed had indeed adjusted his aim, concentrating his fire on sections of the wall that had already been damaged. The impact was devastating. By midday, several breaches had been opened in the outer wall, and the main wall behind it was showing signs of stress. Giustiniani responded by reinforcing the threatened sections with his best troops, including his own Genoese soldiers, who were experienced in siege warfare. The knight positioned himself near the largest breach, where Urban's great bombard was focusing its fire. Each impact sent shudders through the wall, dislodging stones and creating cracks that spread like spider webs through the ancient structure. Around mid-afternoon, the Ottomans launched their first probing attack. A force of about 1,000 men, primarily Azabs, irregular infantry, surged forward toward one of the breaches in the outer wall. They carried scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and light weapons, clearly intending to test the defenders' response rather than to take and hold the position. The knight watched as Giustiniani calmly organized the defense, positioning archers and crossbowmen on the main wall to provide covering fire, while a mixed force of Greeks and Genoese prepared to meet the attackers at the breach. When the Ottomans reached the moat, They were met with a hail of arrows, bolts, and stones that thinned their ranks considerably. Those who made it across found the breach defended by determined men, fighting with the courage of desperation. The battle at the breach was fierce, but brief. The Ottomans, realizing that this was not the easy victory they had hoped for, soon withdrew, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Similar probing attacks at other points along the walls met with similar results. By sunset, the Ottomans had tested the defenses and found them solid despite the damage from the bombardment. As darkness fell and the cannons fell silent once more, the defenders again set to work repairing the damage. They had learned from the previous night, developing more efficient methods and focusing on the most critical areas. The knight noticed that they were now using different materials, earth, timber, and rubble bound together with mortar, which absorbed the impact of cannonballs better than solid stone. This pattern continued for days. Bombardment during daylight hours, repairs at night, occasional probing attacks to test the defenses. The defenders adapted and endured, their initial fear of the cannons giving way to a grim determination. They developed a routine. Work crews would wait just behind the walls, ready to rush forward and repair damage as soon as it occurred. Reserves were positioned to respond quickly to any attack. Communication systems were established using flags and runners to coordinate the defense along the entire length of the walls. The knight moved constantly along the defenses, his silver armor now dulled by dust and smoke, but still recognizable. He fought when needed, helped with repairs when fighting was slack, and provided a silent but powerful inspiration to the defenders. Many credited his seemingly supernatural endurance and courage with giving them the strength to continue despite exhaustion, hunger, and the constant strain of the bombardment. On April 12th, the 6th day of the siege, Mehmed launched a more substantial attack, sending several thousand troops against multiple sections of the wall simultaneously. The fighting was intense, with the Ottomans managing to establish temporary footholds at 2 locations before being driven back by Fierce. On April 12th, the 6th day of the siege, Mehmed launched a more substantial attack, sending several thousand troops against multiple sections of the wall simultaneously. The fighting was intense, with the Ottomans managing to establish temporary footholds at 2 locations before being driven back by fierce counterattacks led by Giustiniani and Emperor Constantine himself. The knight found himself in the thick of the fighting at the Mesoteikion, where a force of Anatolian infantry had breached the outer wall and was attempting to scale the main wall using ladders. Drawing his ancient sword, he moved with a fluid grace that belied the weight of his armor, cutting down attackers with precision and economy of movement. Those who witnessed his fighting that day spoke of it afterward with awe, how he seemed to anticipate every attack, how his blade found gaps in armor that no ordinary warrior could have exploited, how he moved through the chaos of battle like a dancer performing steps rehearsed 1,000 times. When the Ottomans finally withdrew, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded at the base of the walls, the knight remained at his post, showing no signs of fatigue despite hours of continuous combat. The defenders around him, by contrast, were exhausted, many collapsing where they stood once the immediate danger had passed. Giustiniani ordered them relieved by fresh troops, but the knight stayed, his silver armor now stained with blood and dirt. His sword returned to its scabbard, but ready to be drawn again at a moment's notice. As night fell and the repair work began once more, Emperor Constantine approached the knight, his own armor dented and bloodied from the day's fighting. "You fought well today," the emperor said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders above the din of battle. "As did all our defenders. We have shown Mehmed that taking Constantinople will not be as easy as he might have hoped." The knight inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "But this is just the beginning," Constantine continued, his expression grave. "Mehmed has vast resources, men, materials, time. He can afford to lose thousands of soldiers in these attacks. We cannot afford to lose any." He gestured toward the Ottoman camp, where campfires stretched to the horizon. "For every man we lose, he has 100 more. For every stone dislodged from our walls, he has 100 cannonballs to dislodge more." The knight understood the emperor's concern. The mathematics of siege warfare were relentless and usually favored the attacker, especially one with superior numbers and resources. The defenders could win every engagement and still lose the war through simple attrition. "We need a miracle," Constantine said softly, almost to himself. "Divine intervention, or at least a relief force from the west, without either ... He left the thought unfinished, but its implication was clear. The knight remained silent, as was his way, but he placed a gauntleted hand on the emperor's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. Constantine smiled faintly, drawing strength from the simple human contact. "Rest if you can," the emperor said, though he knew the knight required no rest. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges." The next day, April 13th, brought a change in Ottoman tactics. Rather than concentrating their bombardment on the land walls, they began firing on the sea walls along the Golden Horn as well. This was puzzling, as the great chain across the mouth of the harbor prevented their ships from approaching these walls. The knight, observing this from his position near the Mesotachion, suspected that Mehmed was planning something unexpected. His suspicions were confirmed that evening when Byzantine scouts reported unusual activity in the Ottoman camp. Large numbers of men were gathering near the Bosporus shore, and there appeared to be some kind of construction project underway. The scouts couldn't get close enough to determine exactly what was happening, but it was clearly something significant. The answer came at dawn on April 22nd, when lookouts on the sea walls raised the alarm. To the defenders' astonishment, Ottoman ships were appearing in the Golden Horn, behind the chain that was supposed to protect the harbor. Somehow Mehmed had found a way to bypass this critical defense. The knight rushed to the sea walls along with Giustiniani and other commanders to witness this shocking development. From their vantage point, they could see dozens of Ottoman vessels now in the Golden Horn, their presence threatening the previously secure northern flank of the city. "How is this possible?" Giustiniani demanded of no one in particular, his face pale with shock. "The chain is intact. No ship could have broken through it." A Byzantine officer who had been questioning fishermen along the shore provided the answer. "They didn't break the chain, Captain. They went around it. Witnesses say the Turks built a road of greased logs over the hill at Galata and dragged their ships overland from the Bosporus to the Golden Horn." The knight and Giustiniani exchanged glances, both recognizing the audacity and ingenuity of this maneuver. Mehmed had literally carried his fleet overland to outflank the city's naval defenses. It was a feat reminiscent of ancient sieges, something that might have been done by Alexander the Great or Hannibal, but unprecedented in modern warfare. "This changes everything," Giustiniani said grimly. "We now have to defend the sea walls as well as the land walls, stretching our forces even thinner." The knight nodded in agreement. The presence of Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn meant that the city was now effectively surrounded on all sides. The defenders would have to divert precious manpower to guard the sea walls, which had previously been considered secure. It also meant that Ottoman troops could potentially land at multiple points along the northern shore of the city, forcing the defenders to spread out rather than concentrate at the Mesotachion. Emperor Constantine responded to this crisis with characteristic decisiveness. He ordered a portion of the Venetian and Genoese ships in the harbor to engage the Ottoman fleet, while redeploying some of his limited ground forces to strengthen the sea walls. The knight was tasked with assessing the sea wall defenses and identifying the most vulnerable points where the Ottomans might attempt a landing. The sea walls along the Golden Horn were indeed much weaker than the land walls, having been designed with the assumption that the chain would keep enemy ships at bay. They were lower, thinner, and had fewer towers. In many places, houses and other buildings had been constructed right up against them, providing potential cover for attackers. The knight moved methodically along these walls, noting weaknesses and suggesting improvements. Additional barricades, the positioning of archers and artillery, the clearing of buildings that might aid the enemy. On April 28th, the defenders attempted to strike back at the Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn. A small force of Byzantine fire ships, vessels loaded with flammable materials and set ablaze, was launched against the Turkish ships. The knight watched from the walls as these burning vessels drifted toward the Ottoman fleet, driven by the current and the wind. It was a desperate tactic, but one that had worked for the Byzantines in the past. This time, however, the Ottomans were prepared. Their ships quickly moved out of the path of the fire ships, and small boats towed the burning vessels away from the fleet and toward the shore, where they could burn harmlessly. The attack failed completely, and several Byzantine sailors were captured in the process. The failure of the fire ship attack was a blow to morale, but the defenders had little time to dwell on it. The Ottoman bombardment continued relentlessly, day after day, gradually wearing down the walls and the spirits of those who manned them. By the end of April, large sections of the outer wall had been reduced to rubble, and even the main wall was showing serious damage in several places, particularly at the Mesotachion. The defenders worked tirelessly to repair this damage, but they were fighting a losing battle against the Ottoman cannons. Each night they would rebuild what had been destroyed during the day, only to see it demolished again the following morning. The constant strain was taking its toll. Men collapsed from exhaustion, injuries went untreated due to lack of medical supplies, and food was beginning to run short in some quarters of the city. Through it all, the knight remained a constant presence on the walls, his silver armor now dented and scarred, but still distinctive. He fought when fighting was needed, helped with repairs when it was not, and provided silent encouragement by his mere presence. The defenders had come to see him as a talisman of sorts, a symbol of resilience and hope in the face of overwhelming odds. On May 3rd, nearly a month into the siege, a strange atmospheric phenomenon occurred that deeply affected the morale of both sides. A thick fog descended on the city at dusk, unusual for that time of year. As it settled over the domes and towers of Constantinople, it seemed to glow with an eerie, reddish light. To the superstitious, it appeared as if the city itself was bleeding, the fog absorbing the color of the setting sun and transforming it into something ominous and unnatural. The Byzantine population, already on edge from the constant bombardment and the strain of the siege, saw this as a dire omen. Rumors spread rapidly that the fog was a sign of God's displeasure, that it presaged the fall of the city, that it represented the blood that would soon be shed. Priests struggled to calm their congregations, reminding them that natural phenomena were not necessarily divine messages, but many remained convinced that the end was near. The Ottomans, by contrast, interpreted the red fog as a favorable sign. In their camp, it was said that the Prophet Muhammad had promised that Constantinople would fall to a Muslim army, and that its conquest would be heralded by supernatural events. The eerie fog seemed to confirm this prophecy, boosting Ottoman morale even as it dampened that of the defenders. The knight, who had seen far too much of history to be swayed by superstition, viewed the fog simply as an unusual weather condition. But he recognized its psychological impact and worked to counteract it, spending more time among the defenders, demonstrating through his actions that he, at least, had not lost hope. Emperor Constantine also moved quickly to address the situation, ordering special religious processions and services to reassure the population. The most sacred icons and relics of the city were carried along the walls, accompanied by priests chanting prayers and hymns. Constantine himself participated in these processions, bareheaded and humble, praying alongside his subjects for divine protection. These religious observances had a calming effect on the population, reminding them of their shared faith and heritage. The knight observed this with interest, noting how religion could be both a divisive force, as in the conflicts over the union of the churches, and a unifying one in times of crisis. As May progressed, the siege entered a new phase. The Ottoman bombardment continued, but Mehmed also began employing sappers, engineers who dug tunnels beneath the walls with the aim of collapsing them from below. This was a traditional siege tactic, one that had been used since ancient times, but it was particularly dangerous because it could bypass the strongest defenses. The defenders responded with counter-mining operations, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman sappers before they could reach the walls. This subterranean warfare was claustrophobic and terrifying, conducted in near total darkness with the constant threat of cave-ins or ambushes. The knight participated in these operations, his exceptional strength and endurance making him particularly valuable in the confined spaces of the tunnels. On May 16th, the defenders detected and destroyed an Ottoman mine near the Blachanai section of the walls. On May 21st, they intercepted another tunnel, engaging the Ottoman sappers in a brief but brutal underground battle. On May 23rd, they captured and tortured several Turkish officers who revealed the locations of all remaining tunnels, allowing the defenders to neutralize this threat completely. These successes provided a much-needed boost to morale, but they did not change the fundamental dynamics of the siege. The Ottoman bombardment continued to damage the walls faster than they could be repaired, and Mehmed's army showed no signs of abandoning the siege despite the approaching summer heat, and the diseases that typically accompanied it. By late May, the situation within Constantinople was becoming desperate. Food supplies were running low, with strict rationing in place. Many of the wounded died from infections due to lack of proper medical care. The constant strain of the siege, the noise of the bombardment, the fear of imminent attack, the physical exhaustion of continuous repairs and combat was taking a severe psychological toll on the defenders. Yet there were also moments of extraordinary courage and resilience. The night witnessed countless acts of heroism. Ordinary citizens risking their lives to rescue wounded soldiers, priests administering last rites under fire, women and children carrying water and supplies to the defenders on the walls. He saw how the people of Constantinople, despite their earlier divisions, had come together in the face of this existential threat. Emperor Constantine remained a constant presence on the walls, moving from section to section to encourage his troops and assess the situation firsthand. He shared the dangers and privations of his soldiers, refusing special treatment or comfortable quarters. His courage and dignity in the face of almost certain defeat impressed even the most cynical observers, including the knight, who had seen many rulers falter under far less pressure. On May 26th, Ottoman heralds approached the walls under a flag of truce, bearing another message from Sultan Mehmed. The knight was present when Emperor Constantine received this communication, standing silently behind the Byzantine ruler as he read the Sultan's words. Mehmed's message was direct and final. Surrender the city now, and the inhabitants would be spared. Resist further, and no mercy would be shown when Constantinople inevitably fell. The Sultan gave Constantine 24 hours to decide. The emperor did not hesitate in his response. "Tell your master," he instructed the heralds, "that I would rather die than surrender the city. Constantinople is not mine to give away. It belongs to God and to the generations of Romans who have defended it for more than 1,000 years. If Mehmed wants it, he must take it by force, and we will resist him to our last breath." As the heralds departed with this defiant message, Constantine turned to his advisors, including the knight. Mehmed would not have sent this ultimatum if he were not preparing for a final assault. He said gravely, "The bombardment has done its work. The walls are breached in many places. He believes the time has come to end this siege with one massive attack." Giustiniani nodded in agreement. "The signs are there. They've been stockpiling scaling ladders and gathering their elite units near the Mesotachion. I believe the attack will come within days, possibly tomorrow." "Then we must be ready," Constantine declared. "Double the guards tonight. Position our reserves where they can respond quickly to any sector. Ensure that every able-bodied man is armed and prepared to fight." He paused, looking each of his commanders in the eye. "This will be the decisive battle. If we repel this assault, Mehmed may be forced to abandon the siege. If we fail—" He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the implications. If the Ottomans breached the walls in force, the city would fall, and the 3 days of unrestricted plunder would follow. A fate too terrible to contemplate. That night, a solemn and extraordinary ceremony took place in the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for nearly 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine, along with his court and military commanders, attended a special divine liturgy that united Orthodox and Catholic Christians in prayer for the salvation of the city. The knight stood at the back of the vast, domed space, observing the ceremony with a sense of historical perspective that none of the other participants could share. He had been present when the Hagia Sophia was consecrated under Emperor Justinian in 537, had witnessed its desecration during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and had seen its restoration under the Palaiologos dynasty. Now he watched as what might be the final Christian service was held within its hallowed walls. The interior of the cathedral was a wonder of Byzantine architecture and art, its enormous dome seeming to float above the nave, its walls covered with intricate mosaics depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, its surfaces gleaming with gold leaf that caught and reflected the light of thousands of candles and oil lamps. The air was heavy with incense, and the voices of the choir echoed hauntingly through the vast space as they chanted the ancient liturgy. Emperor Constantine knelt before the altar, receiving communion from both Orthodox and Catholic priests in a powerful symbol of Christian unity. Many of those present, including hardline opponents of the union like Gennadius Scholarius, set aside their theological differences in this moment of extreme peril, recognizing that what united them was far more significant than what divided them. After the service, Constantine addressed the assembled congregation, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "Tomorrow," he said, "we may be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice for our faith, our city, and our heritage. Let us do so with courage and dignity, secure in the knowledge that whether we live or die, we remain in God's hands. If it is His will that Constantinople fall, then let us ensure that history remembers that we fell with honor, defending all that we hold sacred." There were tears in many eyes as the emperor concluded his address, but also a renewed sense of purpose and resolve. Whatever happened in the coming days, they would face it together, as Christians and as Romans. As the congregation dispersed, many to return to their posts on the walls, the knight remained in the Hagia Sophia for a time, absorbing the solemn beauty of what might be his final visit to this magnificent structure. The great dome soared above him, its base ringed with windows that would catch the morning light in a few hours. The mosaics gleamed in the candlelight, the faces of saints and emperors gazing down with expressions of eternal serenity. For nearly a millennium, this building had been the heart of Eastern Christianity, a symbol of Byzantine civilization and imperial power. Soon it might serve a different faith, its crosses replaced by crescents, its altar by a mihrab. The knight had seen many sacred places fall to conquerors over the centuries, temples, churches, synagogues. Some had been destroyed, others repurposed, a few preserved out of respect or pragmatism. He wondered what fate awaited the Hagia Sophia if Constantinople fell. Mehmed was known to be a cultured man, an admirer of art and architecture. Perhaps he would recognize the building's transcendent beauty and spare it from destruction. But it would never again be what it had been. The greatest church in Christendom, the wonder of the medieval world. With a final glance at the dome, the knight departed, making his way through darkened streets toward the land walls. The city was eerily quiet, most of its inhabitants either at their defensive posts or huddled in their homes, praying for deliverance. Occasionally he passed patrols of soldiers or groups of civilians carrying supplies to the walls, but for the most part, Constantinople seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the storm that everyone knew was coming. At the Mesoteikion, he found Emperor Constantine and Giustiniani reviewing the defenses one last time. The walls here had suffered the most damage from the Ottoman bombardment, with large sections of the outer wall completely destroyed and significant breaches in the main wall as well. The defenders had done what they could to repair these breaches with wooden palisades, earth-filled barrels, and anything else that might slow an assault. But the once mighty fortifications were now a patchwork of makeshift repairs and crumbling stone. "Ah, our Silver Knight." Constantine greeted him with a weary smile. "I had hoped to find you here. We've positioned our best troops at the most vulnerable points, with reserves ready to reinforce any section that comes under heavy attack. But we are stretched thin, too thin for comfort." The knight nodded in understanding. The defenders numbered perhaps 8,000 men in total, facing an Ottoman army of at least 80,000. Even with the advantage of fighting behind walls, the mathematics of the situation were grim. "We've received reports from our scouts," Giustiniani added, his expression grave. "Unusual activity in the Ottoman camp, troops gathering, officers moving among them, what appears to be some kind of religious ceremony. All signs point to a major assault, probably just before dawn." Again, the knight nodded. It was standard practice in siege warfare to launch major assaults at dawn, when defenders might be at their most fatigued after a night of vigilance. "I've ordered signal fires prepared along the walls," Constantine said, gesturing to piles of wood and pitch positioned at intervals. "If the attack comes in darkness, these will be lit to illuminate the battlefield. And I've stationed runners at key points to carry messages quickly, since the noise of battle will make normal communication impossible." The three of them continued their inspection of the defenses, checking the positioning of troops, the readiness of weapons, the placement of reserves. The knight was impressed by the thoroughness of the preparations, given the limited resources available. Constantine and Giustiniani had done everything possible to maximize their chances of repelling the assault. As they completed their rounds, Constantine paused at a section of wall that offered a clear view of the Ottoman camp. Thousands of campfires dotted the landscape, and even at this distance, they could hear the sounds of the enemy preparing for battle. The shouts of officers, the rhythmic chanting of prayers, the metallic clangor of weapons and armor. "It comes down to this," the Emperor said quietly. "One night, one battle, to determine the fate of 1,000 years of history." He turned to face the knight, his expression solemn in the torchlight. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that it has been an honor to fight alongside you. Your courage and your unique qualities have been an inspiration to all of us." The knight inclined his head in acknowledgement of this praise, though he felt undeserving of it. He had seen too many cities fall, too many brave defenders die, to take much pride in his own contributions. He fought because it was what he did, what he had always done, not out of any expectation of victory or recognition. "I have one request," Constantine continued, his voice dropping so that only the knight and Giustiniani could hear. "If the worst happens, if the walls are breached and the city is clearly lost, I ask that you save yourself. Your abilities make you uniquely capable of escape, even in the most desperate circumstances." and I believe that your journey is not meant to end here, in the ruins of Constantinople." The knight remained motionless, giving no indication of whether he would honor this request. His instinct was to fight to the end, to stand with these brave men who were preparing to sacrifice everything for their city and their faith. But he had lived long enough to know that sometimes survival was the harder path, the one that required more courage than a glorious death. "As for me," Constantine said with quiet dignity, "I will not leave this city. I was born a Roman emperor, and I will die as one, sword in hand, defending the last remnant of the empire that has stood for more than a millennium. History may forget many things, but it will not forget that the last Constantine died fighting for Constantinople." Giustiniani placed a hand on the emperor's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "You will not die alone, Your Majesty. My men and I stand with you to the end." Constantine smiled gratefully at the Genoese captain. "Your loyalty honors me, Captain. Now let us return to our posts. Dawn is not far off, and with it, our final test." The three parted ways, each to their assigned position along the threatened walls. The knight took up his post at a particularly vulnerable section of the Mesoteikion, where repeated cannon strikes had created a partial breach. Around him were a mix of Byzantine, Genoese, and Venetian soldiers, all veterans who had survived the month-long siege thus far. They acknowledged his arrival with nods of respect, drawing courage from his presence. The hours before dawn passed with excruciating slowness. The knight stood motionless at his post, his enhanced senses alert for any sign of the expected assault. Around him, the defenders maintained a tense vigilance, checking and rechecking their weapons, adjusting their armor, some praying quietly, others lost in their own thoughts. Few spoke, and those who did kept their voices low, as if reluctant to disturb the unnatural quiet that had settled over the battlefield. In the Ottoman camp, however, activity was increasing. The knight could hear the growing murmur of thousands of men preparing for battle, the commands of officers organizing their units, the prayers of imams invoking Allah's blessing on the coming assault. Torches and campfires cast a flickering glow over the landscape, revealing the shadowy movements of troops taking up their positions. Shortly after midnight, a new sound reached the knight's ears, a rhythmic chanting from the Ottoman lines, growing steadily in volume and intensity. It was the traditional Islamic battle cry, "Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, God is greatest, God is greatest." The defenders listened in grim silence, many making the sign of the cross as the chanting washed over them like a wave. Emperor Constantine moved along the walls one last time, speaking briefly with each group of defenders, offering words of encouragement and resolve. When he reached the knight's position, he paused, studying the silver armor that gleamed dully in the torchlight. "It begins," he said simply. "May God have mercy on us all." The knight nodded once, drawing his ancient sword in a gesture of readiness. Constantine continued on his rounds, his calm dignity providing strength to his men in these final moments before the storm broke. Around 1:30 a.m. on May 29th, 1453, the Ottoman assault began. The first wave consisted of Bashi bazooks, irregular troops drawn from various parts of the Ottoman Empire. They surged toward the walls with wild cries, carrying scaling ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders met them with a hail of arrows, crossbow bolts, and stones, cutting down many before they reached the walls. Those who made it to the base found themselves struggling to cross the moat and place their ladders while under constant fire from above. The knight watched this initial assault with a professional eye, noting that it was not pressed with full vigor. Mehmed was using these irregulars to test the defenses and tire the defenders before committing his more valuable troops. It was a standard tactic, but no less effective for being predictable. For nearly 2 hours, the Bashi Bazouks continued their attacks, suffering heavy casualties but maintaining constant pressure on the defenders. Then, around 3:30 a.m., they withdrew, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded at the base of the walls. There was a brief lull in the fighting, during which the defenders caught their breath and prepared for what they knew would be a more serious assault. It came shortly before 4 a.m., as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky. This time it was the Anatolian troops, more disciplined and better equipped than the irregulars. They attacked in formation, concentrating on the known weak points in the walls, particularly the breaches created by the Ottoman cannons. The fighting was intense, with the defenders struggling to hold their positions against the more determined assault. The knight found himself in the thick of the combat, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision as he cut down attacker after attacker. Around him, the defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that this was the moment of truth. If they could repel this assault, they might survive another day. If they failed, the city was lost. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. The Anatolian troops, despite their greater discipline, were unable to establish a foothold on the walls. Whenever they managed to place ladders and begin climbing, the defenders would push them back, sometimes using long poles with hooks to topple the ladders, other times engaging in hand-to-hand combat at the top of the walls. The knight moved from hotspot to hotspot, his presence often enough to stabilize a wavering defense or turn back a particularly threatening push. But the Ottoman resources seemed inexhaustible. As one group of attackers fell back, another would take its place, maintaining constant pressure on the defenders, who had no reserves to rotate their tired troops. Casualties mounted on both sides, with the defenders unable to afford their losses, while the Ottomans seemed to have an endless supply of fresh soldiers. Around 5 a.m., as the sky brightened with the approaching dawn, the Anatolian troops withdrew, much as the Bashi Bazouks had done earlier. The defenders, exhausted from hours of continuous fighting, used the brief respite to tend to their wounded, redistribute ammunition, and repair what damage they could to their positions. But they knew that the worst was yet to come. The elite Janissaries, Mehmed's personal troops, and the best soldiers in the Ottoman army had not yet been committed to the battle. The knight used this lull to move along the walls, assessing the situation. The defenders had held thus far, but at a heavy cost. Many sections were now manned by only a handful of soldiers, some wounded but still fighting. Ammunition was running low, and exhaustion was taking its toll on even the most determined defenders. If the Janissaries attacked with full force, it was difficult to see how the walls could be held. As he returned to his position, the knight encountered Giustiniani, who was bleeding from a wound to his shoulder, but still directing the defense with calm efficiency. "They're preparing for the final push," the Genoese captain said grimly. "The Janissaries are forming up, and Mehmed himself has moved closer to the walls to observe. This will be the decisive assault." The knight nodded in understanding. The pattern was familiar from countless sieges throughout history. Use lesser troops to wear down the defenders, then commit your elite forces for the final breakthrough. It was a tactic that had proven effective time and again, and there was little reason to think it would fail here, against walls already breached and defenders already exhausted. Emperor Constantine joined them, his armor dented and blooded, but his bearing still regal. "The Janissaries," he said simply, having observed the same preparations as Giustiniani. "Yes, Your Majesty," Giustiniani confirmed. "They will attack soon, probably supported by the full force of the Ottoman artillery." Constantine nodded, his expression resolute. "Then this is the moment of truth. We have held them off twice. If we can repel the Janissaries as well, Mehmed may be forced to reconsider the entire siege." It was a slim hope, but not entirely unfounded. Even the Ottoman Sultan, with his vast resources, could not maintain the siege indefinitely. Disease, supply problems, and the approach of summer with its debilitating heat might compel him to withdraw if this assault failed. "I will stay here, at the Mesoteikion," Constantine declared. "This is where the main attack will come, and this is where the fate of Constantinople will be decided." Giustiniani and the knight took up positions on either side of the emperor, forming a formidable trio at the most vulnerable point in the city's defenses. Around them, the remaining defenders braced themselves for the coming storm, checking their weapons one last time. Some praying quietly, others staring grimly at the Ottoman lines where the Janissaries were now clearly visible, their distinctive white headgear standing out in the growing light. At approximately 5:30 a.m., the Ottoman cannons opened fire in a coordinated barrage, concentrating on the already damaged sections of the wall. The impact was devastating, collapsing several weakened areas and creating new breaches. Before the dust had settled, the Janissaries charged forward with disciplined precision, focusing their attack on the Mesoteikion and particularly on a section near the gate of St. Romanus, where the wall had been severely damaged. The knight found himself facing the full fury of this elite force, their attack far more coordinated and determined than those of the previous waves. They moved in formation, providing covering fire for their comrades who placed and scaled ladders, working methodically to establish footholds on the walls. Their discipline was impressive, their courage undeniable as they pressed forward despite heavy casualties. For a time, the defenders held, fighting with the desperation of men who knew their lives and their city hung in the balance. The knight's sword flashed in the early morning light as he cut down Janissary after Janissary, his centuries of combat experience allowing him to anticipate their tactics and counter them effectively. Beside him, Emperor Constantine fought with the courage of his namesake, inspiring his men by personal example. On the emperor's other side, Giustiniani directed the defense with tactical brilliance, shifting men and resources to meet each new threat. But the pressure was relentless, and the defenders were reaching the limits of human endurance. After hours of continuous combat, many were wounded, all were exhausted, and ammunition was running critically low. The Janissaries, by contrast, seemed to have inexhaustible reserves of both men and material. The turning point came around 7 a.m. when a group of Janissaries discovered a small postern gate, the Kerka Porta, which had been left partially open during a sortie earlier in the battle. They quickly exploited this opportunity, pouring through the gate and establishing a presence inside the walls. Simultaneously, another group managed to scale the walls near the gate of St. Romanus, overwhelming the few defenders still standing there. As word spread that the Ottomans had breached the walls in multiple places, panic began to set in among some of the defenders. The knight could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. What had been an organized defense was becoming a series of isolated last stands as communication broke down and units lost contact with each other. In the midst of this chaos, a crossbow bolt struck Giustiniani in the chest, penetrating his armor. The Genoese captain staggered, blood flowing from the serious wound. His men rushed to his aid, supporting him as he struggled to remain on his feet. "I must withdraw," Giustiniani gasped, his face pale with pain and blood loss. "The wound, I cannot continue." Emperor Constantine, fighting nearby, heard this and turned in dismay. "Captain, stay at your post," he urged. "Your presence alone is worth 1,000 men." But Giustiniani was beyond hearing or obeying. His men, unwilling to let their commander die on the walls, began carrying him towards the harbor, hoping to evacuate him to a ship where he might receive medical attention. As they departed, many of the Genoese troops followed, leaving a critical gap in the defense. The knight watched this development with a sinking feeling, knowing that Giustiniani's withdrawal might well be the final blow. The knight watched Giustiniani's withdrawal with a sinking feeling. Without the Genoese commander, the defense quickly unraveled. Ottoman forces poured through multiple breaches, overwhelming the remaining defenders. Emperor Constantine, seeing that all was lost, removed his imperial insignia and charged into the thickest fighting, determined to die as a Roman emperor rather than live as a captive. The knight lost sight of him in the chaos, but later accounts claimed Constantine fell near the gate of St. Romanus, his body never identified among the thousands of dead. As Ottoman troops flooded into the city, the knight fought his way through the streets toward the Golden Horn. All around him, the horrors of a city taken by storm unfolded, soldiers looting homes, civilians fleeing in terror, the wounded crying for help that would never come. The magnificent churches and palaces that had stood for centuries were being desecrated, their treasures carried away by the victors. At the harbor, a few ships were still departing, crammed with refugees. The knight fought through a desperate crowd to reach one of the last vessels, a Venetian merchant ship preparing to cast off. The captain, recognizing the silver-armored warrior who had defended the walls so valiantly, ordered his men to wait. As the ship pulled away from the doomed city, the knight stood at the stern, watching Constantinople recede into the distance. The Ottoman flags now flew from the walls, and smoke rose from countless fires throughout the city. The Hagia Sophia, visible above the urban landscape, would soon become a mosque, its crosses replaced by crescents, its Christian mosaics covered with plaster. 1,000 years of Roman history had ended in a single day. The Byzantine Empire, the direct continuation of ancient Rome, had fallen. Europe's eastern bulwark against Islamic expansion was gone. The world would never be the same. Yet as the knight gazed at the fading silhouette of Constantinople, he knew that something of its spirit would endure. The scholars who had escaped would carry Byzantine knowledge and culture to Italy, helping to fuel the Renaissance. the Orthodox Church would continue, preserving Byzantine traditions and faith. And the memory of Constantinople's fall would echo through the centuries, a reminder of both human courage and the impermanence of even the greatest empires. The Silver Knight turned away from the vanishing city, facing west toward an uncertain future. He had witnessed the end of an age, but his own journey would continue. History did not repeat, but he did, moving through time, observing, participating, enduring. Constantinople had fallen, but the world moved on, and so would he, carrying the memory of its glory and its fall to whatever battles awaited him in the centuries to come.